My name is Ben Bland. I'm the director of the Asia-Pacific program at Chatham House here in London. Now, today I'm really pleased that we're going to be taking a truly global view on the BRI from Nagoya to Naples via Naypyidaw. So what is the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, for those who are not familiar? It's a global infrastructure initiative that was launched by Chinese President Xi Jinping in 2013 to connect China to Asia, Europe, and Africa, bridging traditional infrastructure like bridges, roads, and airports, but also digital infrastructure. There's been much debate about what was driving the BRI as it's known from China's perspective. Is it about exporting excess capacity from China's economy, finding new markets for Chinese companies? Is it about exerting geopolitical influence? Or is it about promoting Chinese standards for construction and finance overseas? Or in fact, is it about little more than promoting the power of Xi Jinping himself? Well, it's probably all of those things. But I think it's fair to say there's been much less focus on how the target countries of the BRI perceive it. And I'm pleased to be joined today by three great experts who've all written fantastic articles for International Affairs on this very subject of how different countries, different political establishments and societies are perceiving the BRI. So first up, we're going to have Yuka Kobayashi, who's assistant professor in China and Chinese and international politics at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, of which I'm an alumnus. We have Kei Koga, who's an assistant professor at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, and he's joining us actually from DC, Washington, DC today. And last but not least, we have Giulio Pugliese, who's a part-time professor at the European University Institute in Rome. So the way we're going to work things today is I'm going to ask each of the speakers to introduce the key findings from their articles, and then we're going to have a free-flowing discussion before coming to questions from the audience. So put your thinking caps on now. Really keen to hear your thoughts and particularly your questions to all the panelists. So Yuka, I'm going to come to you first. Why don't you tell us about your paper, Myanmar's Strategy in the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, a Failure in Hedging?
Thanks very much for the introduction. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. It's a great pleasure to be sharing a bit of my research with you. I work primarily on Chinese foreign policy, examining mainly the economic drivers for Chinese foreign policy. And around Xi Jinping coming into power, it became very interesting to examine China, not just in terms of Beijing and what's happening externally in international relations, but to look at what China has been doing in other countries. Since we had Xi Jinping formally unveil the Belt and Road Initiative, as Ben was actually alluding to. And so in that sense, it became very interesting to examine what are the major drivers driving Beijing, how it's being received in these countries, because Belt and Road Initiative is often clumped together in terms of looking at all the countries along the belt, which is going through the economic Silk Road economic belt through Central Asia on beyond to Europe, and also the maritime road going through the various ports into Southeast Asia, South Asia, and beyond. So it's often put together in international relations as China's going out strategy, grand strategy. But I thought the interesting questions were not to examine just what Beijing is doing, but how Beijing's message is being received by recipient countries like Myanmar. So I've looked previously in Central Asia. I have an ongoing project in Europe, but this particular one puts together the field work I collected in terms of putting together Beijing's initiatives and also looking at how it's playing out in Naypyidaw and also the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor. So the various projects that are actually being invested by China and actually been put through in various infrastructure projects. And oftentimes what it's actually being blurred in the literature is how these host nations are actually receiving it. A lot of it's been really sensationalized as a debt trap, etc. But it's very important to examine what are the conditions domestically. And in the case of Myanmar, throughout the period that we examined Myanmar through the NLD, the Aung San Suu Kyi regime, and then beyond when the coup d'etat happened last year, we're seeing really a very dynamic period in Myanmar's history, in the sense that it's coming out of a very prolonged civil war and strife. So that actually complicates a lot of the Naypyidar's decisions in terms of how to deal with Beijing. And oftentimes literature talks about asymmetric relationships and in terms of the power imbalances between the host nations and Beijing. And in this case, it's actually very interesting to look at this framing through hedging. But one of the key things that we found throughout this field work is that we're actually examining a very dynamic period after 2011 and democratization under the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi. We're actually seeing Myanmar move from a very totalitarian state to a much more democratic state and back again. So here we actually see very dynamic ways in which Myanmar is evolving, complicated by the ongoing peace process and the civil war, and ever more so complicated through things like the Rohingya crisis, which tests Myanmar's legitimacy in the international realm. And if you think about the drivers in Belt and Road Initiative, often people talk about the material drivers, like the economic drivers, finding these ports and connectivity projects. So Beijing's reach actually reaches out furthermore. And also, like, for example, the security drivers. And again, some people look at the ideational things, like in terms of what is Beijing trying to do? And it's been theorized with, okay, do we actually see authoritarianism attracting authoritarian regimes, or are we actually seeing the reverse? But a lot of the literature actually tries to theorize from the outside. But in this paper, what we actually tried to do was to bring together what's really happening inside Myanmar. And we collected interviews and fieldwork through 50 interviews of the key people involved in various levels at the projects at this China-Myanmar Economic Corridor. So you have the Musée Mandalay Railway, which tries to connect China and give it gateway. The inner regions like Kunming now actually have access outside China all the way to the deep sea port like Jiaqiu deep sea port. So looking at these very advanced projects, we try to tease out how Myanmar is trying to hedge, but its capacity as hedge is severely compromised given the domestic situation of civil war, and also this kind of legitimacy challenges given its kind of regime change, and also its tests in terms of what's happening in terms of external views of Myanmar, given the Rohingya crisis and the ICJ case. And we really present this with empirical details in terms of how you see connections between China and Myanmar. And oftentimes it's even seen externally, it's easy to draw conclusions saying, okay, Myanmar is going direct into China's arms because of the fact that you have authoritarian regimes with tests with their legitimacy internationally, given China has Xinjiang, Myanmar has Rohingya, but the reality is a lot more complex. And we try to actually show this reality in the sense that it's not exactly that Myanmar tries to actually have these strong relations with China. And we see Myanmar going through this phase of trying to balance Belt and Road Initiative with the free and open Indo-Pacific that I think the later speakers are going to be talking about. So you have the comparable infrastructure initiatives coming from Japan, and also the like-minded states of the democratic states, which try to emphasize a quality infrastructure that's based on transparency and rule of law. So we really look at these kinds of dynamics and show how Myanmar's capacity is severely challenged in terms of their hedging capacity against China, in the way they're actually become very reliant and also difficult to hedge given their domestic realities, given their civil war conditions. So in terms of that, we actually really trace these projects, show from evolution of contracts to how the contracts are actually renewed and challenged, whether or not Myanmar actually has agency or their lack of. And so I'll leave it to you to actually read through the details, but it's actually trying to condense a project of about data collection of about 5-7 years on and off between Myanmar and 3 locations. The key locations, Naypyidaw, Yangon, Jiaoqiu, and also along the Musée Mandalay Railway, and also together with Beijing, what Beijing is actually trying to do, given that they see this Jiaoqiu deep sea port as a key strategic geopolitical position in their maritime road, which is a key component of their Belt and Road Initiative. And I think I'll just leave it to here and open up for the other people to contribute. Thank you.
Thanks, Yuka. You did a great job of condensing all that work into 5 minutes. So thanks for sticking to time. Next up, we have Kei Koga, who's going to talk about Japan's Indo-Pacific question, countering China or shaping a new regional order.
All right. Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you for inviting me to this webinar. My article actually discussed broadly about the evolution of the concept of Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific vision or strategy. So in this webinar, I will particularly focus on Japan's response to the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. So Japan's view on China's BRI has been evolving and starting off from the negative one to the more cautious one. As Japan considered that the core of the BRI is the infrastructure development, Japan's initial response was the creation of its own strategy, the Partnership for Quality Infrastructure, the so-called PQI, which was launched in the 2015. And this initiative emphasized the importance of the sustainable development, economic viability, human development, and so forth. And later, Japan incorporated this initiative into the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy in the 2016. And at first, Japan saw this BRI as China's challenge to the existing international order. And this is because the BRI did not have the same international standards as the Development Assistance Committee, the so-called DAC countries had. And more specifically, China's development practice did not take into account such factors as the financial sustainability, environmental sustainability, the impact on local communities and human rights or the labor rights. So, but despite that, the BRI became popular in developing countries in the Pacific, including the Southeast Asia. And because the developing countries appreciated those lower standards to receive the financial assistance for infrastructure development. And China's decision for the financial assistance has been relatively faster than those of the DAC countries. So from the short-term perspective, China has those advantages. But that said, these practices are not sustainable. The quick construction pursued by China would be sometimes quite harmful and socially, economically, and environmentally. And the foremost example is Sri Lanka, which has not been able to pay back the loans and fell into the debt trap. Or even if you look at the other cases, it might not be implemented. The project might not be implemented if the feasible study is not thorough. And one good example for this is China's proposal for the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed railway in 2015. There are many analyses about the decision, which Indonesia actually chose China over the Japanese proposal. But the fact is that because of its weak feasibility study, China's project faced delay and many setbacks like cost overrun. And while it was supposed to be operational in 2019, even after 6 years, the project has yet to be implemented. So in response to this, the Belt and Road Initiative, Japan doubled down its effort to push forward the PQI, and then transferred it to the expanded partnership for the quality infrastructure. And basically, Japan considered 5 important principles, including economic efficiency, safety, the consideration on the environment and the social impact, and so forth. And also, because these principles are important internationally, Japan pushed forward them through the international forum like G7. So in 2016, G7 adopted the Iseshima Summit, Iseshima principles for the promoting quality infrastructure investment. But interestingly, this strategic kind of posture toward the BRI began to change after the 2017, because Japan did not want to openly confront China like the United States under the Trump administration. Prime Minister Abe stated the four conditional principles in cooperating with China for infrastructure development. Those are namely the openness, transparent process, economic viability, and financial soundness. And this signaled China a possibility for cooperation. And then Japan and China started to discuss how to cooperate their infrastructure projects in the third country through the summit meeting. And I think moreover, the one important fact is that China actually agreed to sign off the G20 principle for quality infrastructure investment in 2019. That is Japan contains Japan's principle for the quality infrastructure development. So basically, this shows the kind of Japan's message toward the China. That is as long as BRI follows those principles, Japan is not going to push back the BRI. But I think there are several challenges. Just quickly, the three things. The first one is the COVID-19. This pandemic had prevented Japan and China from holding a summit. And this diplomatic hiatus slowed the progress of the cooperation. And secondly, US-China rivalry has intensified. And Japan is now more closely aligned with the United States and in pressuring China. So there might be less chance that Japan could actually cooperate with China. And then thirdly, it has not yet been clear whether Chinese development projects on the ground are really following the G20 principles. So the Chinese project needs to be more closely monitored. So I think I get over the 5 or 6 minutes, but this is my take on the Japan's current view on the GPRI. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Kay. And there might be concerns about whether China can deliver, but so far, all our speakers have delivered on time and on budget, which is what we like to see. Just a reminder that this is an on-the-record seminar, so everything is on the record. I think we'll be releasing the recording of the webinar later on. And if you have questions, please raise them in the Q&A box rather than using the raise hand function, and we will get to your questions soon, so start thinking. We have one more speaker to go. It's Giulio Pugliese, who's going to talk to us about his paper, Italy's Embrace of the Belt and Road Initiative, Populist Foreign Policy and Political Marketing. No question mark in his title, unlike the other two.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me today. Yes, it's actually a bit of a provocative take, the one I and my co-authors, Francesca Ghiretti and Aurelio Incisa, one from Merix and Aurelio from Hong Kong University, a dream team of Italian researchers looking at Asia, have produced. We have essentially tried to understand whether Italy has broken ranks in 2019 when the Western Europe's first all-out populist government, made up of the Five Star Movement and the Lega per Salvini parties, decided to grant Xi Jinping a state visit in Rome, and on that occasion sign the framework memorandum of understanding to accede to China's Belt and Road Initiative. We argue provocatively, you might say, but if you look carefully, as we did, with quite some ground, that Italy actually did not break ranks. Italy was actually simply signaling, to touch upon Yuka's emphasis on communication and receptiveness of messages. Italy was, the populist coalition was signaling simply that they were aiming at results in foreign security policy, specifically by signing a landmark MOU with China. But this was much more shallow than it met the eye. And we argue very clearly on the basis of primary sources, and especially a wider range of elite interviews, that the decision-making process was not hijacked by amateurs at their first government experience, as often has happened in other liberal democracies that have witnessed the rise of populist governments. Because the Italian national state apparatus still has the capacity to function as guardrail for the decision making. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation has particularly been watchful of Rome's decision to actually sign the Belt and Road Initiative framework MOU. And this has also been a long-standing point of key cadres within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of willing to accede to the BRI MOU with clear eyes to leverage the playing field and to also court Chinese investments and possibly grant Italy the chance to export more in the Chinese markets. And in fact, and this is the second point, there is a continuum with the Gentiloni and Renzi Euro-Atlantic governments that have actually seen overtures to China, to the point that Gentiloni in 2017, and this is a very Euro-Atlantic government, the Prime Minister himself attended and was the only G7 member to attend the Belt and Road Forum for International Cooperation in 2017. And finally, and this is the most important point we want to emphasize, the substance of the MOU was particularly constructive. First and foremost, the framework MOU was made public, which is unusual for Belt and Road Initiative MOUs. And it enshrined the very multilateral standards that Japan, for instance, as Kay has mentioned, wants to emphasize in dealing with China. That is openness, transparency, sustainability in government financing. And in a sense, what the Italian government tried to do is that it tried to kill two birds with one stone, tried to show results through political marketing operations to its domestic audiences, while de facto squaring the circle and multilateralizing within EU frameworks and international standards an initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative, that is typically bilateral in nature. And so in a sense, what Italy was trying to do, oddly enough, was very much in line with the rhetorical commitments that the Japanese government is actually aiming for in terms of inclusiveness and whatnot. And so it has been essentially, in our opinion, a triumph of style over substance, where Italy played up spurious symbolism for the sake of showcasing results back home, but interestingly enough, also to Chinese audiences, because there is agency that third parties can play. And Italy has often played the Rome card when underlining the fact that the Silk Road usually stopped in Rome. And so there is this willingness to also give Xi Jinping a Roman benediction to his big Silk Road initiative by having him visit in all the pomp and circumstance Rome in March of 2019. And so what we see and witness now, to conclude, is that we are rethinking our approach to China, but that very much depends on the changing atmosphere and environment, especially across the Atlantic in Washington, D.C., and to some extent also in Europe. But in March 2019, the Eurosceptic government was pretty much in line with previous governments, with the decision-making structure in place and guardrails being placed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, and effectively trying to make the best out of essentially a very shallow memorandum of understanding. And I'm sorry for being the over-loquacious Italian if I actually stepped over my 5 minutes.
No, on time, delivering substance with the style, which is good. Thanks for that, Giulio. I'm going to come to Yuka with a question. We're going to come to audience questions shortly, but I just have a very basic question, actually, Yuka, as someone who specializes on Chinese politics. Does the BRI actually exist, or is it just a label for things that were already happening? I mean, there's no Belt and Road Department. There's no formal list of projects. And we've seen Chinese companies call everything from buying football teams in the Czech Republic to buying gaming companies in other parts of the world, Belt and Road investment. So yeah, does this thing actually exist?
And that's an excellent question, actually. I really resisted to say that my research topic is on the Belt and Road Initiative, because I think it's actually really playing along the tunes of what the PRC wants you to actually talk about now, in the sense that China has always been going out, it's had this going out strategy from Jiang Zemin era. And, it's had this presence in Africa, Latin America. They've been doing this for a while. And then this Ilu really came with Xi Jinping trying to bring all of these projects together. So a lot of the projects in Myanmar along CMEC are old projects, like, for example, the pipeline, Sona Dam, that actually existed, a decade at least before Belt and Road Initiative. So a lot of these things were there before. China has always had this going out strategy. The economy has to have somewhere to go. So China has been doing this, but it's really this kind of, there's this really amazing clip that China put together 5 years anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative, where you have this kind of Coke's ads talking about, I want to give the world a Coke. It's, I want to give the world a road. And it's all about the sing and song of the Belt and Road Initiative. And that's what China wants us to really dance to. And I think I resisted saying that because it is really what they want us to really talk about. But in reality, this going out strategy existed before. A lot of the projects in CMEC are old projects that have been brought together under the umbrella of Belt and Road Initiative. And this idea of string of pearls along the maritime road, along these kinds of ports in Southeast Asia and South Asia really existed pre-Xi Jinping era. So it's really something that existed before. MOFCOM has talked about this kind of pushing China out to China, Africa, China, Latin America. So it's existed before. What I think is different about the Belt and Road Initiative is around 2013, you see a flip where Europe's investments in China actually are lower than China's investments in Europe. So the one thing that's changed since Xi Jinping coming into power is that China's reach in Europe has really flipped. They're more important in Europe than Europe is more important in China. And so in that sense, like China being the recipient of FDI had really flipped, and Europe was now receiving it. So in a sense, the table had turned. So Belt and Road Initiative signals this reach of China into Europe. And I think that's what's changed. But in terms of China's ambitions to go global, especially economically and also geostrategically, has always been there.
Thanks. You can, I mean, this is my question maybe for you or for any of the others if you want to come in, but are we now seeing a new phase of China's going out strategy or Belt and Road or whatever you want to call it because of the slowdown in China connected to the pandemic, but also the fact that we had so many big projects like the Jakarta to Bandung high-speed railway, the huge rail investment project in Laos. We had a number of large projects and countries are just going to take quite a while to digest them. So it seems to me there's already some initial evidence of a bit of a slowdown, maybe even a rethink in Beijing. So are we moving into another phase here where China is going to look to do something different, maybe to aim for more of those higher standards that Kay and Julio were talking about? I don't know if either of you two would want to come in on that point.
Okay, thank you. So just quickly, I think most of the developing countries that receive the BRI fund actually kind of started to think the reality. I mean, the reality of the BRI. So at the beginning, when the BRI concept was launched, then people were just kind of thought okay, so we could get the financial assistance and we could actually build the road and we could build those kind of infrastructure. But then after that, they actually realized the projects went slowly, and then they couldn't actually implement. There was a kind of lack of the financial assistance, and then there was also like pushback coming from the domestic arena as well. So I think like it's not like the rosy picture they could actually have anymore. And then I think like this over the 7 or already like 9 years after the concept was launched, then the people started to think, okay, so maybe like there's a reality like we have to actually face, and like that it does not necessarily mean that those kind of countries kind of rejecting the BRI. There's still opportunity and financial assistance, but they actually kind of think about the downsides of the BRI, and so I think like that's the kind of change we face.
Okay, did Yuka or Julio? Do you want to, Julio, please?
I could add just my 2 cents. My feeling is that and again, to stress the agency that, for instance, Italy played out in 2019, that there was already a rethink in China for the very issues that Kay raised, not just an international pushback against the BRI, specifically in Washington, DC, but also a domestic pushback, because when we talk with a degree of naivety and oversimplification, China's debt trap diplomacy actually, first and foremost, is not evidenced that China has acted as consciously as the world's loan shark, but debt that is pushed by Chinese policy banks that is not being paid back, or it's paid back by equities in assets that are hardly strategic, like the Hambantota port. That doesn't necessarily amount to good debt in Chinese hands. So it is a problem also for China to actually go on a spending spree in terms of infrastructure diplomacy of the mammoth scale that you mentioned earlier, Ben. And so it's the scaling down, and the quality infrastructure principles are actually good also for China's policy banks, balance books. And on top of that, we see more active competition from European players, Quad players, Japan, also with the US under Biden, to chip in with infrastructure and connectivity projects. And this may actually raise the standards of the Belt and Road Initiative by bringing in competition, and even by bringing in capacity building in developing countries that might negotiate better terms with BRI projects.
It's a good point, and obviously the debt, goes both ways, right? It often lands Chinese companies with problems that weren't necessarily intended. And I share your view that I think some of the talk of debt traps as kind of premeditated plans overestimates some of the planning that's gone into these projects. Lots of them were done on the hoof, often with little coordination, because China doesn't have a BRI agency, and there are various competing, private companies, state-owned companies, centralized SOEs, and other regional, provincial SOEs operating overseas. And there's a multiplicity of actors not always necessarily coordinating to deliver on some sort of centralized Beijing policy objective. So I think that's a good point. One very basic question I wanted to ask you all as well is about competition, because you all in your own different ways talk about competing infrastructure initiatives. There's obviously the Japan's FOIP, there's the EU's infrastructure initiative, the Indo-Pacific economic framework recently that the US launched. But I mean, are these actually competing? I mean, if China funds a railway in Laos, a German tourist or a German company can use that railway as much as anyone else. If the Italian government funds a bridge that's built in Indonesia, a Chinese manufacturer can benefit from that. If China's not part of the CPTPP trade arrangement, but Chinese companies operating in the CPTPP area in the manufacturing industry in Malaysia or Vietnam, they can surely benefit from some of the greater access to the Japanese market that brings. So we've all got very carried away with the idea of competition here, but are these initiatives really competing? Or in some senses, could this actually be a true win-win, especially for developing countries, to be plugged into all these different economies and physical systems and trading systems? Yuka, I see you had your hand up first, and then Kay will come to you next.
Thanks very much, Ben. I think it's a really excellent question. I think I also want to actually connect it with what other panelists were talking about earlier, in the sense that, if you look at sort of connectivity platforms, it's true that you actually have cooperation like the FOIP and the BRI, there's echoes between, and they're talking about connectivity platforms like the European China-Europe connectivity platform. So there are various initiatives like this. But from my perspective, I think a lot of these things are a lot of talk, and the ship has sailed in terms of cooperation. And I say this for two reasons, in the sense that you also see the pushback for Belt and Road, not just from the external sort of, investments that China's made in its Belt and Road, but also domestically. Why are we funding these roads and rail outside, and when we have so many issues domestically? So there's this pushback domestically in China. So there's this notion of dual circulation that's been going around in China. And there's also this discussion with what's happening with the US-China competition in terms of decoupling, what's happening in the US-China trade war. So I think in terms of infrastructure, key infrastructure, critical infrastructure, having this connectivity, that kind of discussion of having cooperative platforms, that ship has already sailed. And we're actually in a new era where there's a lot of pushback in various levels, internationally, also domestically in China, and also in terms of, various kind of ideas around connectivity. And you're having initiatives that really try to counter and come up with different kind of standards. Like, for example, if you look at what's happening with the Quad, they're talking about infrastructure, what's happening with IPEF, and you talked about CPTPP and also RCEP, right? You're having a lot of these constellations. And it seems from Beijing's perspective, a lot of these things are there for like containing China. And the discussion, they perceive it as very much a way of containing China. And the discussion is becoming a lot more heightened in terms of decoupling. And if you look at critical infrastructure, these are key things for kind of, security and also economics. So there, I think, we're entering a new phase where there's pushback against the Belt and Road itself, but also there's this kind of idea that more integratedness, more interconnectedness is a problem. And we're actually speaking months after this kind of crisis in Ukraine. If you think about the Belt and Road Initiative, it connects to Russia and Ukraine. So in a sense, I don't know how much of a future you have for the Belt and Road Initiative when the two geographically massive countries connecting China externally to Europe is actually at war.
And Kay, you wanted to come in.
All right. Thank you so much. I just would like to touch on the those framing, why, I mean, like the FOIP, free and open in the Pacific, or the IPEF, the recently launched by the United States. I think those are not necessarily or specifically targeted to the BRI. It made the BRI actually concept triggered those kind of framework, but it's not necessarily against or countering the BRI process. It's more like the Japan was more concerned about the challenges, China's challenges in the rules making or international order that the United States and Japan and also other kind of Western countries constructed since the end of the Cold War. So I think like those are the so if you take a look at the contents of the free and open in the Pacific proposed by Japan, then it includes the maritime security. It includes the economic prosperity. It includes the capacity building for the Southeast Asian countries or regional countries. So I think it's not necessarily like, again, like the infrastructure development. And having said that, I think the FOIP includes a part of the, I mean, it's considering definitely the thinking about the how to respond the China's Belt and Road Initiative. And the Japan regards BRI as the part of the I mean, the core of the BRI is the infrastructure development. And then given that the China has been promoting the different set of standards for the infrastructure development, Japan and the like-minded countries wanted to push back, not to actually kind of create the infrastructure without thinking about the local communities or financial soundness or those kind of the economic viability, etc. So I think like the framing is the important, and then the again like the I don't think the I don't actually put the FOIP vis-a-vis the Chinese BRI. It's actually FOIP is the more broader than the BRI.
Thanks, Kay. And Julio, you wanted to add something?
Yes, I agree that this competition can actually be actually for the greater good of global connectivity. And I very much agree with the framing of your question. At the same time, and I'm terribly sorry for doing what I'm about to do, I've actually written an article with Aurelio Incisa called The Free and Open Indo-Pacific versus the Belt and Road, Spheres of Influence and Sino-Japanese Relations in Pacific Review. It's in print now, which hints that there are zero-sum dynamics, competitive dynamics. And these have to do very much with the fact that Japan's partnership for quality infrastructure and infrastructure competition aims at really avoiding that smaller economies in the Asia Pacific develop asymmetric dependencies vis-a-vis China, and that these may translate into a sphere of influence. And this is important because we're witnessing the Quad, for instance, turning into a provider of public goods. I mean, even vaccine provisions are a matter of competition between China and Quad countries. I would go back to what Yuka said. This is absolutely central to critical and strategic sectors such as ICT and technological revolutions pertaining to the digital transformation, because there are competitive dynamics not just in how important telecommunication is for security, and we've witnessed this in the Pacific Islands, but also in terms of having first mover advantage to favor one's own technological industries. And mark my words, the fact that we're living in a time and age where geopolitical disruption coincides with technological disruption makes that competition not just geopolitical or for spheres of influence, but also for in economic market share potentially. We've witnessed that with Huawei, and Japan has basically, and Australia have been very much in line with essentially containing and pressuring the Huawei out of the 5G race.
Thanks, Julia. So the first audience question I'm going to ask comes from Alexander Matthews. And he's asking about the Global Development Initiative and the Global Security Initiative, which are two new initiatives launched by Xi Jinping, I think, in the last few months or in the last year. There's obviously a party congress coming up and feels the need to launch some new slogans. But do these, the GDI and the GSI, do they signal a sense that the BRI is not achieving its goals? Yuka, maybe you want to have a go at this one first.
Oh, thanks very much. I think we're looking at Xi Jinping in the toughest sort of phase of his leadership, in a sense that we're actually going towards the next phase of leadership. Whether or not he stays on has been actually quite challenged. So in that sense, I think showing legitimacy, given that a lot of economic development has been stagnant throughout the COVID era. Also, this US-China trade dispute, and in terms of China's image abroad, it's been quite negative, to say the least. So it's a very tough phase in Xi Jinping's leadership, and a lot of these kinds of policies are unleashed domestically to really garner support and to show that the CCP is doing something. They're actually going forward and coming up with sort of solutions, and they're not just sitting back and taking all of this and not doing anything about it. So I think it's a critical time, and it's also a time where there actually are serious kind of challenges also domestically in terms of what's happening in Xinjiang, what's happening with sort of other minority groups, in the sense of how much stamina does the regime have going forward. And a lot of these slogans and projects and policies are unleashed precisely to show that there are plans. The CCP actually has plans to go forward, has alternatives to really take it to the new era. And I think in a way, the more kind of communication you have from the center, the more kind of activities and slogans that you have and policies that you have show that underneath you actually have a fragile situation. So domestically and also internationally, we're actually seeing China becoming very a fragile superpower. And it's really how, she actually goes through this period, maneuvers himself out of this kind of very difficult situation with COVID, how he actually can really come up with solutions. And I think in that sense, it's no surprise that, the Belt and Road Initiative, there's a lot of pushback domestically, internationally. A lot of the things that looked very rosy in the beginning have become really challenged. And you're also seeing a lot of challenges to Xi's leadership. And there you're actually getting a very edited kind of version of it externally. But I would say that in terms of what she has going forward in this year, it's the most challenging period. And in terms of where he's going to come out on that, I think the verdict is pretty much out on that, in the sense that he is really trying to acquire this charismatic sort of leadership still to date, and he is going to push these things forward. But the reality is it's actually a very difficult job.
Thanks, Yuka. The next question, I'm going to raise a point asked by Abbas Faiz, which is about the response to growing Chinese influence from democracies. So he's asking whether kind of resistance to this is about a fear of losing market strategy, or if they losing market, or do they see something more serious hidden in China's strategy? So I guess this question is about, is this an ideological question or a standards question, that people fear a world where China sets the rules of the road and increases its power, or is kind of resistance and opposition from Japan and the West and some of the partner countries actually just about kind of economic competition and fear of losing out financially? So yeah, is this a values question and a standards one, or is this just about who's going to win market access? Who wants to take this one on? Julio and Kay. Okay, Kay, why don't you go first, and then Julio next?
All right. Again, thank you so much. I think it can be both. I mean, like the value question and also the standard question. I mean, I think China's assistant is very, very useful for the non-democratic developing countries, because without considering those the environmental questions, human rights, and also the community impact, they could actually get the assistance from the China. So in that sense, obviously non-democratic countries wants to get it, no matter what happen, right? So I think in that sense, China's assistance is to some extent harmful to promoting the value kind of democratic values in the world. And then in response to that, Japan and the other countries actually try to create the new framework, and then they try to push forward the rules and then values that they actually like upheld for a long time. So I guess this is a kind of again, like relating to the value system and then standard, because if you kind of stick to the particular value, then that automatically creates a certain kind of standards. And then that is the kind of the things that Japan and other countries perceive as a challenge to the existing international order.
And Julia.
Absolutely, I fully agree with the valid points remarked. And I would just add that there is, of course, also a growing recognition, not just in Washington, D.C., where Antony Blinken, who is very close to President Biden, has framed it in terms of a challenge between technocracies and techno-democracies, but also growingly in Europe, including in Germany. You see calls by the president of the Federation of German Industries, or the Minister of Finance of Germany, stressing that you want to make sure that your value chains are in places where you actually share values and where you do not depend too much on asymmetric dependencies. And that's not just aimed at Russia, but increasingly also China. So this is part and parcel of our identity. But to add to it very briefly, China's strand of digital Leninism and the ability that it has to also use through intrusive technology vast amount of data, which is basically oil, to improve its own technological prowess. That can also be a competition, an economic, foster economic competition. So values, after all, in English means two things. So I guess I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, you. I mean, I'd push back a little bit from the area that I know best, Southeast Asia, where to me, it doesn't seem that looking at regime type tells you much about how countries engage with Chinese investment strategies. I mean, the biggest and most successful democracy in Southeast Asia, and arguably in Asia, in some ways, Indonesia has been one of the keenest partners for Chinese investment in the last few years. And actually, it's places like Vietnam and Singapore that are, well, far less democratic in their own different ways, that have been actually much more resistant, I would say. So I think it probably tells you a lot less. And even on the question of technological standards, I think there are plenty of governments, including in the democracies in much of Asia, who have their own reasons for using surveillance tools on their own populations and controlling data flows without kind of wanting to support China's worldview. It's just something that the Indonesian government or the Singaporean or the Indian, for that matter, wants to do for their own political and economic reasons. I want to come to you Connect, with a question actually from a friend of mine I got on WhatsApp about the US and China in Myanmar, because you talk about competition between those two, but to what extent now, post the coup, do you think, is there any window for the US and China to maybe cooperate on trying to pressure the military? Because to some extent, China built a good relationship with the National League for Democracy and Aung San Suu Kyi, and you might argue that there's some sort of shared interests in China and the US in having some sort of return to stability, at least the release of Aung San Suu Kyi from prison, some roadmap back to quasi-democracy might be in both their interests. And perhaps it might be easier for them to cooperate on an issue that's not bilateral in a sense. So do you see any potential there for that, or is that wishful thinking?
It's a great question. Okay, can I actually answer that question saying, if you'd actually asked me the same question last year, this time, I would have said yes. But I think that window has closed from late last year, where I think for the first part of the coup, right afterwards, you actually saw China very cautious, not wanting to take sides. And you have to bear in mind, they share this massive border, and having a very unstable border is the least preferable option for China. So they were very cautious in the beginning, not trying to signal outward support for the Tatmadaw or the other side. So they were very much viewing and in the background, right? And everything they were doing was very much in the hidden. And I think if you'd asked me this question this time last year, I would have said definitely yes, there is this window. But I think now that we actually saw, especially from late last year, more and more kind of support coming from China and also from Russia for the Tatmadaw, I think in a sense, they've already made their decision. And I think in the beginning, they were cautious. They, as you say rightly, there was a lot of investment that China made with the NLD in the previous regime. So stability was the number one thing that was important, given that there was so much investment in the country. But especially around the summer, late summer, you're actually seeing further closeness between the Tatmadaw and China, and also Russia, where you're actually seeing a lot of military arms and support coming from Russia and China for their continued oppression of the domestic society, right? So from late last year, I think this kind of any kind of conversation or cooperation bilaterally in Myanmar, it's unfortunately something that's not possible anymore.
Yeah, that is pretty unfortunate indeed. We're almost out of time, but I do have one more question for all of you. And it's something that I thought about while reading all your papers, which are very different, but there are some similarities. And one that really struck me was that, to a great extent, Japan, Myanmar, and Italy, all very different countries, are all somehow hedging their bets on China, not necessarily using the academic language of hedging, but in practice, they're hedging their bets. They've all got deep economic relationships with China. They're all in future expecting to have, in some senses, even deeper economic relationships, or at least they're going to find it difficult to economically decouple. And to varying degrees, they're all relying on the US, either as an ally in the case of Italy and Japan, or as an active participant in the region to balance China's security power and China's power to set its standards, etc., in the world. But is this window for kind of hedging and not choosing a side now closing? Every government wishes that it doesn't have to choose. But how close are we to the point where, at least for the country or countries you're looking at, countries do have to pick a side between the US and the West or China? How close are we to that point? And I guess we'll go to Kay first, because you raised this point explicitly in your paper, then Julio, and then the last word to you, Yuka. So Kay, why don't you tell us?
Okay, so I think the windows of the hedging, even though like I have the different kind of the conceptualization of hedging, but like if I take it like the really casually, I think the Japan's kind of hedging is the disappearing. I think it's kind of the window is narrowing down, and then Japan is taking more and more side of the United States and the Western countries. So I guess the window of cooperation with China is unfortunately the closing. But then I'd like to kind of just add one thing is that if the Japan could use the multilateral diplomacy, like including the ASEAN countries or the other multilateral platform, there might be some more the windows. So the bilaterally narrowing, multilaterally still open.
Julia.
I think that with the present world trends and the need to also align with the other side of the Atlantic, there is a tendency also on the basis of ideological considerations that Chinese capital is less welcome. And in fact, there's sterner export controls against China. And again, even something as tame, in my opinion, as the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, which is in the deep freeze between the European Union and China, is basically dead. And I think that it was perfectly legitimate to have something that was equivalent or mirroring the US-China Phase 1 deal. But I was surprised that even European voices were saying, oh, well, the incoming Biden administration doesn't like it. Why should we have it? And I don't understand it. So I guess, yes, the window to hedge is shrinking also for Western European players, especially, I mean, including Italy.
And what's your take on this? I mean, I guess in particular in Southeast Asia, countries are even more kind of bound to this idea that they don't want to have to choose, and they hope to have space for a lot longer. And I guess that ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, in normal times anyway, would kind of give them extra cover. Do you think, yeah, it does? And how long will that cover last?
I think you're right in the sense that Southeast Asia is really one of the regions that really would not want to take a side, and they would resist this the most. But as the world is going into what's called the next Cold War, or I don't know, World War III, a lot of this kind of journalistic take on this, I think it's becoming more and more difficult to carve up that space for hedging your bets. And I think the space for Southeast Asia, those resist it the most, but in effect, you've already seen it very much choosing sides informally. And you're also seeing this multilaterally in the sense that this week in the WTO, you're actually having discussions where the Russian representative speaks and the rest of 30 delegation members actually leave the building. So you're really seeing, even in multilateral integrated levels of like World Trade Organization, institutions like that, this kind of divide. And one thing I would say is I would really caution against using this Cold War narrative, because I don't think this democracy versus autocracies is a very useful kind of divide. It's a lot more complicated than that, because if you see the Putin-Xi statement, they say they're democratic. So they have a very different notion of this. And I think this is where this kind of value-based diplomacy and the Indo-Pacific tilt becomes really complicated, in the sense that I think it's a lot more than just regime types, and you need to go into the depth. And I think this kind of research going beyond the external views of what's happening when these dynamics are very useful when you're thinking about these kinds of issues that's playing out internationally. Thank you.
I think that's a really important point to end on, Yuka. So thanks so much for that. And thanks as well to Julio and to Kay and to Isabel for organizing things today. We're not going to make you choose sides, but we are glad that you chose Chatham House and International Affairs. So thanks to everyone for participating, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks again, and goodbye.